So tonight we're looking at the civil rights movement, first part of the civil rights movement, and we're looking at the kind of the biggest piece or the biggest cause of the civil rights movement, which were these ideas of discrimination and segregation. So your essential question asks, what was segregation and how did it impact the United States? So the civil rights movement was a political, legal, and social struggle to gain full citizenship rights for African Americans. It lasted from the end of Reconstruction in the 1870s all the way through modern day time. We still have a civil rights movement going on today. The one that we're specifically looking at has to do with African Americans, but there have been civil rights movements for a variety of different groups within the United States over the many years that we've fought these kinds of battles. So the civil rights movement was a challenge to this idea of segregation. Segregation is the system of laws and customs that separates African Americans from whites. And it was a physical separation as well as a separation just of rights, like facilities were actually separated. So during the movement, individuals and organizations challenged segregation and discrimination, and they challenged them using a variety of different methods, protests, boycotts, marches, refusal to abide by laws. So there was nonviolent, the majority of the civil rights movement was a nonviolent protest led by Martin Luther King, but there were pieces of the civil rights movement and there were protesters of segregation that weren't necessarily peaceful as well. So segregation was an attempt to essentially separate the two races. And it was specifically in the South that we had these problems, had these segregation issues. So it was called the Jim Crow system, and we've looked at Jim Crow laws in the past, so you probably have a really good idea of what the Jim Crow laws are. And they were called Jim Crow laws because of this character that was basically people felt like portrayed all of the horrible, the negative stereotypes of slavery. So it was really a derogatory term that was used in the South. It became common in southern states following the end of Reconstruction. So slaves were freed and given some rights after they were freed, but a lot of those rights were revoked the more we moved on in history. African Americans had to go to separate schools. They had different types of transportation. They had different restaurants, different parks. And a lot of those facilities that were set aside for African Americans were not good facilities. They did not get the funding that the white schools and the white parks received. So over the next 75 years, from 1877 all the way essentially through modern time today, Jim Crow signs really separated the races in every aspect of life. And water fountains is the big one that you see the pictures of, is whites only water fountains. And we're going to look at some of those images over the next couple of days, and you looked at those images in your DBQ as well. So voting rights were one of the big issues, one of the big things that were denied during this time period. Between 1890 and 1910, the southern states passed laws that essentially established these voting requirements. They were used to prevent African Americans from having the right to vote and to really kind of prevent the 15th Amendment from being effective. And remember that the 15th Amendment was designed to protect those rights to vote, but didn't really end up protecting them for a lot of the later half of the 1800s. So voting requirements included things like the ability to read and write, so literacy tests. It included poll taxes, which meant that people could not necessarily, or that people had to pay in order to vote, and a lot of people didn't have the funds to pay that extra tax. So these types of things were loopholes to the 15th Amendment that southern states really felt like would keep those African Americans from voting. Northern states were better. Although the ideas of segregation still existed in the North was definitely not innocent in all of this. Up to 1910, only 10% of the African American population lived in the North. Remember that a lot of the African American population was in the South because of the use of slaves, because the shipment of slaves triangular trade came into the southern states. So that migration, that migration that we talked about, the Great Migration, didn't occur until after 1910. African Americans usually had the freedom to vote in the North. In the late 1800s, African Americans sued to stop this idea of the separation of facilities. They felt like everybody should be using the same facilities, and the court case is Plessy versus Ferguson. It's a really, really famous court case in American history. And in that case, the Supreme Court decided that segregation was legal. So it was not one of the, more shining moments of the Supreme Court, but it was the decision that they made at the time. Now keep in mind that that is overruled in a later decision, Brown versus Board of Education, which we are going to talk about tomorrow night. So the big ways that people protested, they formed organizations. Of course, one of the most famous of those organizations is the NAACP, or the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People. That was funded in 1909, or began in 1809. And these organizations are going to begin to advocate strongly for segregation to end. And so we're going to start to see more and more of those desegregation talks occurring after these bigger organizations are formed. So keep in mind that this has to do with answering question 1 of your essential questions for your test. This is a good way to study. You need to understand these ideas of segregation, and I'll see you guys tomorrow.